Welcome to Files of the Damned. Tonight, we reopen a case buried in shadows, a hidden lab, a city in fear, and a man whose obsession rewrote the rules of science. London in the 1800s was a city of smoke, sickness, and secrets. Beneath its cobblestone streets and fog-shrouded alleys, a second city pulsed, one of shadows, whispers, and quiet horrors. This is where our story begins. Not in a palace or court, but in a cold cellar lit by flickering candlelight. In that cramped room stood Dr. Thaddeus Grieve, a man whose name would never appear in medical textbooks, but whose deeds would echo through backroom gossip for generations. Grieve was once a respected physician, trained at Oxford, admired by peers, and destined for a future in elite surgery. But somewhere along the line, admiration turned to unease, and curiosity turned to obsession. The doctor became fascinated by one question: how much could you learn from a body after death? And how close to death could you study it before it was too late? When hospitals denied him the subjects he craved, he began to look elsewhere. First to morgues, then to paupers' graves, and finally to places no one dared speak of. He moved his practice to the East End, to an abandoned butcher's shop with thick stone walls and no windows. There, in what he called his observation cellar, he began work that most would label madness. He hired no nurses, took no patients, and covered his windows with thick black cloth. Neighbors reported strange sounds at night: saws, coughing, sometimes crying. No one had proof of wrongdoing, but all who passed that building quickened their step. Dr. Grieve began publishing anonymous letters in fringe medical journals, describing experiments that bordered on the grotesque. He claimed to revive the muscles of corpses with copper wires, to extract memories from brain tissue, to hear phantom voices in dying lungs. Most doctors laughed it off as fiction, until one letter described something no one could ignore: a living subject. The letter was titled "An Interruption of Death: Notes on a Transitional State." It described a patient who had been legally declared dead, yet was revived by electrical stimulation after 15 minutes. More shocking than the revival was what the subject allegedly said: a long monologue in a language unknown to any scholar. Experts dismissed the story, but whispers spread in the underground medical scene. Soon, Grieve had visitors. Young doctors desperate to see for themselves what he was doing beneath that butcher's shop. Most left disturbed. A few stayed on. And so a small cult of curiosity grew around the doctor. Loyal, secretive, and increasingly bold. One night, a fire broke out in a nearby bakery and spread to Grieve's block. The flames drew a crowd, and with it, a chance for the public to glimpse what lay inside his lab. Firefighters broke down the door and dragged out crates, papers, and broken instruments. Inside, one crate was something that would later vanish before police could catalog it: a small skeleton with copper wiring embedded along its spine. That moment, though brief, was enough to ignite panic. Newspapers ran with headlines like "House of the Dead" and "Doctor of Darkness." Public fear grew so intense that the police were forced to open an official inquiry. But when they returned to the cellar days later, the place was empty. Not a scrap of paper. Not a jar. Not a single trace of Dr. Thaddeus Grieve. It was as if he had vanished into the smoke. Rumors swirled that he fled to France, that he was murdered by his own followers, that he had found a way to cheat death itself. What remained was a single wall. Carved into the brick, scratched in with a scalpel, were the words: "Death is not a door. It is a corridor." The official investigation into Dr. Thaddeus Grieve's lab yielded little more than dust and rumor. But in the weeks following the fire, a strange pattern emerged. Individuals connected to the doctor began to disappear. One by one, former students, patients, and associates simply left the city or were never heard from again. Police interviewed one man, a former medical student named Edgar Mallory, who had once worked alongside Grieve in the early days. Mallory was pale, gaunt, and visibly shaken during questioning. He spoke of nights without end and of hearing a sound in the lab that didn't belong to the living or the dead. When asked what Grieve had truly been trying to do, Mallory replied, he wanted to touch the soul. He believed it had mass. That quote was enough to ignite another wave of public fascination and hysteria. A group of spiritualists seized on the case, calling Grieve a pioneer of afterlife science, and claimed to receive messages from him. During one transcript published in a fringe London magazine described a man trapped between pulses who begged not to be found. Meanwhile, deep in the city archives, a clerk named Marianne Ellis uncovered something far more tangible. She found that the address of Grieve's lab had once belonged to another man, a physician named Abram Lexham, who vanished in 1811 under mysterious circumstances. Lexham's final journal entry, preserved in a university collection, described an unnamed student who asked too many questions about the still-living body. The handwriting in that entry matched a letter sent to a surgical review nearly 20 years later. Signed T.G. Was Grieve the same man, or had he inherited Lexham's obsession? Regardless, records soon showed the land where the lab stood had changed hands multiple times, each time under a different name, but always with a medical license attached. Neighbors spoke of odd deliveries, crates arriving at night, strange chemicals, the smell of burning hair. Most disturbing was a report filed in 1869 by a police constable named Whitmore. It's claimed to have been drawn to the site by the screams of a young girl. He described breaking in to find an iron table, restraints, and a mirror that reflected a room not like the one I stood in. His report was suppressed, and Whitmore was quietly discharged from the force 2 weeks later. That might have ended the story. A chilling case lost to time. But in 1872, a man was arrested in Dover for grave robbery. He called himself Thomas Grieve and claimed to be the nephew of the infamous doctor. But when shown a photograph of Thaddeus Grieve taken in 1843, the man laughed and said, "That's me. That photo was taken yesterday." He had no identification, no known relatives, and no explanation for his age. Medical examiners found his body to be perfectly preserved. No signs of aging, disease, or trauma. He refused food, drank only small amounts of water, and would mutter the same phrase when alone. "It's not death that ends you. It's forgetting." Authorities sent him to a private asylum outside of Kent, where he lived for only 3 more weeks before collapsing into a coma. Doctors found that his brain still showed activity for several days after death, but no one could explain how. The asylum burned to the ground a month later. No bodies were recovered. In the years since, stories of the hidden lab have faded into urban legend, a ghost story for med students and night nurses. But there are still those who whisper about it in the darker corners of London, who claim to have seen blue sparks in cellar windows long since boarded up. One letter, dated 1891, describes a child who disappeared for 3 days and returned with strange burns along her spine and an inability to speak her own name. Another, from 1904, tells of a sewer worker who found a sealed iron door beneath the east end, with a surgical table bolted to the ceiling above. The table was empty, but the lights, which had no known power source, were still flickering. And in the center of the room, beneath layers of dust, sat a single copper wire, curled like a serpent, waiting. In the early 1900s, London's East End was rapidly modernizing. Old buildings were demolished, streets widened, and underground tunnels expanded. During one such construction project in 1907, workers broke into a hidden chamber buried beneath a row of homes set for demolition. The room was circular, windowless, and lined with iron panels etched with strange symbols no one could translate. At the center was an examination table, scorched, rusted, and chained to the floor. In a metal box nearby, engineers found a collection of notes sealed in wax and dated 1839. They were signed T.G. The notes described a series of experiments designed to measure consciousness as it left the body. One entry read, "I believe the soul is a current. It flickers in the nerves. If captured in time, it may speak again. Another passage warned, if the vessel is reawakened too soon, what returns may not be entirely itself. Fearing bad press, city officials quietly removed the chamber from all construction reports and buried it again in concrete. But not before one worker, James Redford, copied several pages of the journal into his personal diary. Years later, Redford's grandson published those entries in a self-funded book titled The Electric Soul: Forbidden Science in Victorian London. It received little attention at first, dismissed as pseudoscience and conspiracy. But in 1963, a team of researchers at Cambridge referenced the book in a paper on near-death experiences. One of the authors, Dr. Lillian Hawthorne, claimed the descriptions in Grieve's journal closely matched testimonies of coma patients revived after flatlining. She believed the theory of a measurable consciousness might hold scientific merit. Hawthorne applied for a grant to investigate and disappeared 2 weeks after the request was denied. Her apartment was found undisturbed, with only one thing missing: a letter opener shaped like a surgical scalpel. The case remains unsolved. In the 1980s, paranormal investigators revived interest in the story, especially as strange electrical disturbances were reported in the neighborhood where Grieve's lab once stood. Residents claimed to hear faint weeping through basement pipes, and several homes experienced light bulbs bursting every evening at precisely 2:11 a.m. One homeowner recorded the sound and brought it to a local technician who enhanced the audio. The result was a voice, soft, distorted, repeating a single sentence: "I only wanted to listen." That same phrase appeared in the margins of Grieve's surviving journals. By the 2000s, the legend of the hidden lab had become part of internet lore, passed around forums, reenacted on ghost hunting shows, and debated by skeptics. But in 2018, a new lead reignited the mystery. A woman named Eloise Denham, a freelance historian, was sorting old university files when she discovered a locked case misfiled under meteorological studies. Inside were photographs, sepia-toned, badly decayed, showing what appeared to be a dissection in progress, lit by candles and electrical coils. The subject on the table was visibly breathing. Next to the table stood a man in a dark coat, face obscured, but the initials TG were stitched into the lapel. Experts could not verify the authenticity of the photos, but one chemical analysis suggested they dated to the mid-1800s. Denham submitted the evidence to a historical journal, but the files were never published. A week later, her apartment was robbed. Only the case and her backup drives were taken. No suspects were ever found. Today, the exact location of Grieve's lab remains unknown, though some claim it lies beneath a forgotten intersection in the East End, a place where compasses spin and cell signals die. Every few years, someone rediscovers a piece of the story: a diary, a blueprint, a name etched into an old desk at a medical school. Each clue points to the same conclusion: that the Dr. S work may not have stopped. It may have simply changed hands. Whether Grieve truly sought knowledge, immortality, or something darker, we may never know. But one thing is certain: London has never forgotten the man who looked at death and saw only potential. We'll return soon with another case buried in the shadows. This has been Files of the Damned. Until then, keep your lights low and your questions quiet.